first question is basically going to be, I'm going to ask you to give us a definition of postmodernism. What is it? And yeah, go ahead from there.
I like to start with easy questions.
Yeah, well, perhaps not. You can make this the second question. It doesn't matter.
That's fine. I think part of the problem with postmodernism and the extreme reactions we're getting in our culture today, both against whatever it means and for it, is that nobody wants to define it. And part of the problem is I don't think it can be defined in a very quick way. Certainly when it started, it began in architecture, and it was a form of architecture that saw the disadvantages, both social and architectural, of modernist architecture. It didn't deny that modernist architecture existed, but it did try to return to things like the sense of the street, the history of our lived relation to space, and to restore things like ornament that had been destroyed with modernism. When you take that, which was the first definition of it in cultural terms, to other art forms, what I think you get is a form of very historical art. This is literature or painting, which recalls the history of other art. This is where parody comes in, because it doesn't always recall it with reverence. There's often a kind of ironic relationship with that past. But also a kind of self-reflexivity, an awareness of a self-consciousness about the act of being, fiction or painting or photography. So the combination of an ironic relationship to the past, a distanced relationship to the past, but a recalling, in other words, not the modern look forward, but a look back, combined with this self-consciousness, is I think what characterizes the postmodern. There's a political end of it. I don't know if you want me to go into that. The political end of it, and this is what interested me in postmodernism from the start, was I couldn't figure out why both the political right and the political left rejected postmodernism. There's something funny about this. And I think what's funny about it, and it comes back to how irony works generally, is that postmodernism appears to be art that is critical of dominant cultural forces. And I'm thinking things like capitalism or patriarchy or even humanism, as it's represented in the university. But at the same time, as it's being critical, is also complicitous with it. In other words, there's no self-congratulatory subversiveness in this because it's implicated in it. So you get art which is bestseller, novels which are bestsellers, for example, which also are being taught in postmodernism courses. And it's that combination of the complicity and the criticism that interested me in it. And what happens, I think, is that the left sees only the complicity, and therefore it wants to reject this. The right tends to see only the criticism and reject it without seeing the two rubbing against each other, which I think make it into the postmodern.
There's a lot of people in the left, for example, who have embraced postmodernism as well, especially people who are doing the stuff on popular culture, who essentially view the whole, let's say, a novel that's being turned into a bestseller, and they want to examine how people read these things and derive meaning and how those meanings circulate within culture. What can you say about that kind of relationship that goes on between postmodernism and a kind of a critical approach that tries to analyze the formation, the cultural formation that people use, cultural meanings that people use?
Well, I think that, and this is where postmodernism is overlapping to some extent with work that's being done in Marxist material analysis, in particular post-colonial work in feminism being the most obvious, but one could also look at work in gay and lesbian theorizing as well, and others. But I think what's interesting is that exactly what you described is going on in postmodern work. It's also going on in those individual concerns, but it's really a matter of overlap. I don't think they're the same thing. And the difference that I would see is a political one. Instead of the complicity, what you're getting in the Marxist or the feminist or the post-colonial approach is you're getting the emphasis on the criticism. And built into feminism, and certainly into post-colonialism and Marxism, is a theory of agency, a way we can move to political action that I don't see as part of the postmodern. I see the postmodern as deconstructing, as laying out the problem. And you could argue that that's the first step toward moving to action. But I don't think within postmodernism, there is that move to action. And I think that's why Marxist critics like Frederick Jameson have really had to come down hard in some ways on postmodernism, where they've had to say that there is no, and they always point to the modernist avant-garde, which did have that political impulse, as the opposite. And I think they're right to some extent.
Yeah, one of the arguments I think is that the modernism did have an avant-garde and there was an impulse to exchange, but there is a lot of times postmodernism is classified as an exhaustion of modernism.
Yeah. No, I don't think it's an exhaustion. I think it's an ironizing of it. I think it's not. I mean, there are two camps. There's a camp that sees it as a break from modernism, and the camp that sees it as a continuation, positive or negative, of modernism. Both are true to some extent, as with architecture. Architecture, certainly, postmodern architecture was a continuation of modernism insofar as it didn't stop using concrete. It didn't stop using the material advances, structural advances that modernism had brought to architecture. On the other hand, it did break from it in its politics of representation of built space. So there is a break in some ways, but a continuation in others. And the same is true in literature, where the self-reflexivity, the self-consciousness we see in postmodern literature isn't new. First of all, it's not just modernist. It goes back to Tristram Shandy, to Don Quixote in the fictional form. So that isn't new, and yet the complicity side of it, the awareness that one can't get out of the dominance that one is contesting, I see as much more a postmodern thing than a modern thing, where there was definitely a desire to get out of it, and a belief that in a way one could transcend the nightmare of history that Stephen Dedalus talks about.
And that means that as a political agent or as a force of political action, postmodern is essentially what this allows that.
Well, I mean, you can, and certain people have read it that way, unless you want to see it as, because it deconstructs and lays out and critiques, that it makes possible another step. But I don't think, as I said, I don't see it as that step. I don't think it's necessarily politically quietistic, which people would argue. I just think that it's stage one, and you can or cannot, depending on whether you want to, move to political action. I think feminists have, post-colonial critics clearly have. And the problem in talking about postmodernism today is that it overlaps so much with those other concerns. They have so many of the same interests and concerns.
Let's talk about your work on parody and irony. Essentially, what are you trying to do there?
Well, it's part of working on postmodernism in a way, or chicken and egg problem. I'm not sure which came first. I'm interested in irony, for example, because I think it incarnates this postmodern problem of complicity and critique. Because irony is a way of speaking a dominant discourse, but meaning something else. So you get listened to, well, you get heard, and you may even get listened to, I suppose. And you also, people don't just say, oh, it's an oppositional view and block it off. Okay, so it can be used by oppositional groups to speak to a dominant culture from within and subvert it at the same time. So that's why I'm interested in irony, but the minute you look at that kind of irony, I've discovered there's all the other kinds. There's the elitist put-down irony, there's all the other kinds, and that's the complexity of it. And that's what I'm interested in at the moment.
Irony and parody are the two dominant forms within postmodernism. Is there any other things about it?
The self-reflexivity that I mentioned before is certainly part of it. Parody is one way of looking at art's relationship to the art that came before it, and the argument that one never makes art out of a vacuum, that there's always this history of art, is certainly, I think, a dominant part of postmodernism. I think those are the main characters. The trouble is one can get in specific works, specific examples of other things, but the common denominator across various art forms appears to be self-reflexivity, parody, irony, and a view of history, I should say.
Oh, okay. Are you writing a book right now on ethnic...
on multicultural. Well, it's a book called Other Solitudes, which looks at other than the French and English cultures in Canada, and looking at a range in terms of the age of writers, the when they arrived in Canada, whether they're first generation immigrants, second, third, fourth, and whether and the whole range from European to South American to Eastern, Far East, Near East, to West Indian, African, whatever. We've tried to get as wide a range as we possibly could. It's a series of interviews and short fiction.
And this is going to come out this year?
In September.
How did you, now this is, we'll get into the personal stuff, how did you get involved in the topics and issues that...
Two reasons. One did come right out of postmodernism.
Yeah.
And that was inevitable, I think, because one of the things that characterizes postmodernism is, that I didn't mention, is an interest in the different, the local, the particular, rather than the universal, which is a standard humanist concept, that we work with universals that have eternal value. This is quite the opposite, where one is interested in the local and the particular. And in a way, postmodernism was made possible by the civil rights movement in the United States in the 60s, by feminism, which in some ways was enabled by that, and by subsequent other groups that have made us aware of difference within that universal culture that I certainly had been taught as an undergraduate, that I was studying. So that's part of my interest, was in the local and the different, which involves racial and ethnic differences from dominant cultures. The other is my own background, and despite having a very wasp name, my maiden name was Bortolotti. And having lost that in marriage, and I got married at a time when I didn't know women who kept their own maiden names, so that I took my husband's name. I went through a period of time where I realized I had lost the sign of my ethnic identity. And I've increasingly over the years, and I did do some of my graduate work in Italian, wanted to recuperate, to get back to that part. I'm second generation, so that I never learned Italian at home. It was something that I had to learn in university, and that was important to me to learn that. And so I've always had this interest, and in working on postmodernism and Canadian literature in particular, being aware that Canadian literature has always been a literature of immigration. Maybe largely British immigration, but it has been a literature of immigration. And then looking at my particular community, the Italian Canadian community, but also others. And lately I've been particularly interested in not just whether multiculturalism, as in this volume, is something that works, and that's one of the questions behind the volume. But also, in my own work on irony, how do different groups use ironies and to what ends?
Do we have any examples of that?
One of the curious things I found was that I looked at Italian Canadian and Ukrainian Canadian writers, because I wanted to get two groups that had been here for a fairly long period of time, see what happened. And I found writers who use ironies about absolutely everything except their own background. There's no ironizing of your immigrant parents. And I don't know whether what you find is a range that goes, and it's not a wide range, from nostalgia to the elegiac. But no irony. Lots of irony about everything else in our culture. But when it comes to that, a real limitation, except when dealing with stereotypes. And that's obviously, which is a playing ground for ironies, for playing against the stereotypes that one has been associated with, and there you do find it. But
isn't that sort of different from, say, Jewish Canadian or Jewish American?
Very.
Where there is a great deal of irony.
Yes, and particularly self-deprecating kind of irony that has become almost a trademark. Yes, I thought that was very strange, and part of it may have to do with when the groups emigrated. I think this is one thing I found, that maybe with time you can ironize more. Irony has that distancing you were talking about, that it has that distancing ability and suggestion, and maybe it takes time, maybe it takes another generation before one can ironize pain, which I think immigration is an experience of pain for a lot of people. It's not a wonderful, liberating thing. A lot of people don't come because they want to particularly, but because they have to. So that probably is part of it. But we also found that it wasn't just distance in the interviews, certainly, that we did. It wasn't just distance from time of immigration, but race. And it made a big difference whether you were European or Latin American immigrant of Spanish background, and whether you were Black or Chinese. This made an immense difference in the response to immigration, and subsequently to their living in Canada and the kinds of ironies they're going to use when talking about it.
Is there a kind of a Canadian irony, or if you could classify there, that you put your fingers on?
Well, everybody says it's self-deprecating. And I think there certainly are enough examples that that's true. But what I found when I was studying Canadian, I started this by looking at a corpus of Canadian writing. Canadian poetry in particular, because I wanted to look at shorter units rather than larger structural ironies that you would find in novels. And I wanted to look at Canadian painting and photography as well. So from that corpus, contemporary, for a wide range of artists in terms of gender, sexual orientation, race, much as I could, I found an entire range of ironies, not just one kind. Everything from the simply rhetorical use of irony to the playful, lots of playful ironies, to the self-deprecating. I have to admit there were a lot of examples of self-deprecating irony. To the more negative self-protective ironies, to distancing ironies, to ironies that get really more negative, that were used evasively perhaps. Some were clearly put-downs, elitist ironies. Some were very oppositional, sometimes with satiric intent to correct vices or follies, as the definition goes. Other times just to attack, or to be defensive. They're defensive and offensive kinds of irony. I found examples of all of these, and there are probably lots more. So I'm not sure I found one kind.
That dominates that characteristic of Canadian. And have you looked at the American ironies at all?
Not yet. That's still to come. Because I suspect it's different. Most people who write on Canadian irony, and there aren't that many, do suggest that where Canadians figure themselves as the iron figure, which in the Greek distinction, there's an iron and an alazon. And the iron is a self-deprecating, modest, it's Socrates, but it's the other side of that, the alazon, the braggart, who gets sort of taken down by the iron. Well, the Americans usually tend to get cast by Canadians as the boaster figure, whereas the Canadian is the self-deprecating one. I think there's a certain national mythology going on there that may not be, in fact, proved by looking at the material. But I haven't looked at the American yet.
I guess we use a different line, but just your thoughts on it. We were talking the other day to the biologist, Peter, he's an Italian. Started his work as a biologist, and then from there moved into some cultural studies of perception, all kinds of things. But his influence was with a guy named Kennedy out of Scarborough College. And the question related to Canada says, I just thought it was somewhat amazing, actually, that his conversion is influenced by Canadian. And we have Marshall.
Only Canadians think like that.
Do you think there's any season? There's certainly a lot of thought given Canada cultural studies and leadership. Is there a reason for that?
The usual answer given is that because we had people like Innocent and McLuhan, their interest in communications, because this was such an enormous country, and communication was the basis of Canada, that it was, we had to build a railway before we could do anything. That communication and the problems of communication are built into the very fabric of Canadian history. And there is something to that, perhaps. I think we've just perhaps been very lucky at having some very important thinkers, what we used to call seminal thinkers until the problems with that word were pointed out to us. In the area of communications, which becomes cultural studies, and in literature, Northrop Frye had that impact in a very different way, because it was a very formalist model, but it had social consequences. And I think that interest in cultural social relations is part of Canada's intellectual heritage. I think it's an interesting point.
And you came out of that sort of intellectual environment as well?
I did to some extent, except that I was raised intellectually in my undergraduate years, certainly as a standard liberal humanist. I really believed I was studying the eternal and the universal in art, and it was really only with graduate studies, part of which were done in the States and in Italy, where I discovered structuralism and cultural studies generally, that I came to question that, and from there to work in literary theory and in theories of culture, and subsequently in modes of subversion like irony and parody.
Was your first book Narcissistic narrative?
Yes, which was my thesis, a version of my thesis. Yeah.
Now, you were focusing on sort of a narcissistic trope.
Well, there I was interested in self-reflexivity. I was interested in particular in novels that were about being novels. And not just in a descriptive sense of looking at how these novels did this, but in what this implied for a theory of the novel. Because what these books tended to do, and why critics seemed to hate them, was they sort of took the critic's job away from him or her. Here was a book that talked about what it was, and about its own theoretical preconditions and assumptions that it had, and what was left for the critic to do. You know, the critic becomes redundant in a way, and I wanted to look at exactly that, the complexity of that.
That was the first foray.
In a way, it was, only I didn't know it. In fact, I'm embarrassed when I think about it, because when the book was reissued in paperback a few years after it was first published, I couldn't change the text, but I could write an introduction. And I chose to write an introduction, which people tease me about mercilessly, which says, you know, I'm not going to use the word postmodern, it's just another one of those words. And you learn to live with those words. And in fact, I think I was provoked to work on postmodernism precisely as an attempt to give a definition to the word. I kept seeing the word used without being defined. And that's what provoked me into that, I think.
Do you have anything else that you want to do? You cover all the bases?
I think so. The course at the Institute in particular is, if you want me to talk about that a bit, is about the discursive politics of irony. In other words, how irony is used in all of its complex functions within certain cultural contexts. And in fact, today in the class we were discussing the ROM exhibit, Into the Heart of Africa, which in some ways is into the heart of irony. And there are very real problems about interpretation of irony. There are many problems about the show and about its reception, but that was one of the things. And I've tried to bring examples to the class, not just from visual arts and from literature, which are the two fields that I've been looking at, but also from newspapers, from things going on around us like this show. I've sent them off on a walking tour of Toronto to look at public art in the city and its context, to see if any of them are ironic in context, as a way of studying the context of irony.
Do you have any good example of public art in Toronto that sort of...
Oh, sure, there are lots, actually. There's Joe Thafford's The Pasture, as you probably know, off on Adelaide, or Richmond. Now I've forgotten which it's on. Which one? It must be Richmond. Anyway, right near, between Bay and York, there are two enormous office buildings, and then there's this little patch of grass between the two, on which there are 7 life-size bronze cows. And they're very realistic. They look like real cows. But they're bronze, and they're sitting on little pads of grass, and it's called The Pasture. Now it's urban, rural, it's all the ironies of material too, bronze versus flesh. There are added ironies, I'm told, because they're digging up the grass, and they've placed the cows on mats of some kind, which students who have gone to see this since this has happened have said look like placemats, which add new ironies. But my favorite irony about that one is that if you look up the street from this particular spot called The Pasture, up York Street north, you look right at Osgoode Hall and the gates in front of it. And the first gate you see is the cow gate, which is to keep cows out. And clearly this was the historical pasture in the city, and they needed cows' gates in front of that building to keep those cows out. So there are all kinds of interesting contextual ironies that go on there.
So it's reconstructed around the urban environment.
Yeah. There are lots of examples.